It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. John Harfouch. This is the next speaker in the series organized by faculty and staff for Justice in Palestine. There's a number of co-sponsors. I'll run through them really quickly, and then I will introduce John. And he has a presentation of about 30 to 40 minutes, and then we'll have plenty of time for discussion. So the Center for Arab and Islamic Studies is one of the driving forces behind the series, but we also have co-sponsorships by the Center for Peace and Justice Education, the Center for Political Theology, the Departments of Global Interdisciplinary Studies, Sociology and Criminology, Political Science, Education and Counseling, and the programs in Latin American Studies, Africana Studies, and Cultural Studies. So John Harfouch studies the history of philosophy from 1600 to the present, with a particular focus on issues of racism and colonialism. He published in 2018 a book entitled Another Mind-Body Problem, A History of Racial Non-Being. He's also written extensively on imperialism and Orientalism in the 19th and 20th centuries. His most recent work is on the archive of Palestinian philosopher Fayez Sayegh, and this work is evolving into, it sounds like, a potential book project, and he also has another parallel project that is an edited compilation on Palestine. His talk tonight is entitled The UN Resolution on Zionism as a Form of Racism. So please join me in welcoming Dr. John Harfouch.
Well, first off, thanks, Gabriel, and thanks everyone for coming out and supporting this speaker series. It looks really great. I wish I was here for some of the other speakers. I heard Karina Mullen was really great. So thanks for putting this on. Everybody knows how hard this work is to do anyway, and then given the circumstances, it's even harder. So I really do appreciate the invitation and hosting me. So with that said, I'll just get into this. As Gabriel mentioned, this is on UN Resolution 3379 from 1975, which declared Zionism a form of racism. November 10th will mark the 50th anniversary of Resolution 3379. The statement effectively condemns Zionism as a racist political ideology and Israel as a racist state, to be relegated alongside other colonial, apartheid, and imperial state projects. Passing easily with a vote of 72 in favor and 32 against, with 35 nations abstaining, it was overwhelmingly supported by the newly liberated third world countries, who saw the statement as a challenge to American and European hegemony. Resolution 3379 wasn't the work of a single individual. Nonetheless, several Palestinian intellectuals deserve special recognition for their efforts in passing the resolution. Today I'd like to focus on the work of one individual, a philosopher by training, who spearheaded the effort and argued the Palestinian case on the assembly floor. That's Fayez Sayegh, here. That's Fayez Sayegh, and his speeches on the matter are composed here in this pamphlet. Oh, come on, sorry. Are composed here in this pamphlet, which will serve as the basis of my talk today. Specifically, I'd like to work through Sayegh's writings to come to a better understanding as to just what he and his counterparts within the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, meant when they argued that Zionism is racism. How did they understand racism, and where does Zionist racism fit within what they call the Palestine problem more generally? Given that context, what then is anti-racism from this Palestinian point of view? Before we get into that, I'd like to say just a few words about who Fayez Sayegh was. He was born in 1922. He grew up in Tabriya, Palestine. He studied philosophy at the American University of Beirut, and in 1950 he took his PhD from Georgetown, writing a dissertation on existential methodology. He went on to create the Arab Information Center in Brooklyn in 1956, and in 1965 he founded the PLO Research Center in Beirut. He was an accomplished diplomat, professor, and public activist. To get an idea of his work ethic and output, consider that during a 2-week period in 1954, so he was just 4 years out of graduate school, Sayegh delivered 54 lectures in 2 weeks, traveling all over the United States, arguing the Palestinian cause. That was part of a 4-year period during which he delivered 770 total public lectures. My presentation today will draw from his writings for the PLO Research Center. So it's useful to have some idea as to just what that center was, since again, Sayegh was its architect, founder, and for a short period the director of the center. In its 18 years of operation, the center published a total of 340 books, like this. At its peak, the center employed roughly 80 full-time researchers in a 6-story building in downtown Beirut. 10 departments were dedicated to a variety of activities, including translating Israeli radio, archiving Palestinian history, and researching Zionism's history and ideology. The aim of the center was to study Palestinian identity and history, as well as the history, practices, and ideology of the Zionist occupation, since, to quote Sayegh's proposal for the center, knowing the enemy is a parallel process to knowing the self. The research was in large part designed to provide in-depth studies for Fedayeen, who at this point in time in the late 60s were developing more sophisticated military operations. The center provided militants with sophisticated theory as well as concrete studies of Israel and the United States. On February 6, 1983, Israeli forces bombed the center, killing 18 and injuring 115. What's left of it is now scattered around the world, and much of what I'll talk about today is from the Fayez Sayegh archive held at the University of Utah, where I've been studying on and off for the past number of years. Turning now to Resolution 3379, Sayegh spoke 4 times in the fall of 1975 before the General Assembly, arguing all the ways in which Zionism is racism. In his first speech on the matter, he began by distinguishing the question of racism from the question of Palestine more generally, stating, quote, "The issue before us is not the Palestine question. It is not the Arab-Israeli conflict. It is not the situation in the Middle East. The situation before us is the elimination of all forms of racial discrimination. And the draft resolution under consideration addresses itself to Zionism as a form of racism and racial discrimination and to nothing else," end quote. He then went on to define Zionism, explaining that he would be working within accepted Zionist self-definitions, before then arguing that Zionism is racism in both ideology and practice, according to known and accepted UN definitions of racism. However, this way of framing the issue raises the question, if Zionist racism is not identical to the Palestine question, what exactly is the Palestine question? And what is racism when approached within the framework of that question? And finally, what is the relationship between the Palestine question, or Palestine problem, and Zionist racism? For an answer, let's start with this speech Sayegh delivered in 1969. Here, Sayegh defines the problem in terms of, quote, "the fate of the human beings who are the people of Palestine," end quote. And that fate, elimination, is a result of what Zionists call, quote, "the ingathering of the exiles." Quoting Sayegh, "For the idea of Zionism by definition meant that the Jews of the world, whom Zionism considers to be one nation, should leave all the countries of their residence and citizenship and congregate together in a land, which would then be a purely Jewish state, a land in which there would be no non-Jews. Somehow the Palestinians had to disappear," end quote. From this characterization of the problem, we can see that what's at stake is the wholesale displacement of one society for another. Naturally, these ingathering settlers need land and resources. Accordingly, as this so-called ingathering of the exiles recruited more settlers, Zionist-controlled territory would have to expand. And while Zionists first tried buying Palestinian land, once they realized that process was too slow, David Ben-Gurion once lamented, "It would take 1,000 years to occupy Palestine, and we don't want to wait 1,000 years," they resorted to brute militarism. That brings us then to a second iteration of the problem, which is found here in this pamphlet. There we read, quote, "The crux of the Palestine problem is the fate of a people and its homeland. It is the piecemeal conquest and continued seizure of the entire country by military force. It is the forcible dispossession and displacement of the bulk of the indigenous population and the subjugation of the rest. It is also the massive importation of alien colonists to replace the evicted and to lord it over the conquered. And it is the colonization by the foreign settlers of both the expropriated private land and the seized national resources of the overpowered people," end quote. Again, the problem is one of elimination, but in this formulation, Sayegh foregrounds the violence of the problem. If, as Weizmann once declared, Palestine is to be made as Jewish as England is English, and the continuous flow of settlers requires an expanding land base to support them, and if that land cannot be purchased at a satisfactory rate and must then be acquired by force, then Israel is, in effect, a state of war. Sayegh describes this dynamic of Israeli aggrandizement by wars of encroachment when he summarizes the whole situation on an American talk show in 1967. "Every Israeli who is in Israel today is there because an Arab has been made not to be. The being of Israel is the non-being of Palestine," end quote. The so-called ingathering of exiles is the production of this non-being. Zionism is a movement or force whereby Israeli development, Israeli being, stands in a dialectical relationship with Palestinian non-being. And so when David Ben-Gurion told the Israeli parliament in 1963 that the Zionist mission of ingathering the exiles means, quote, "the fructification and population of the wasteland," the problem of Palestine from Sayegh's point of view is precisely the production of that wasteland. When Sayegh writes in Zionist Colonialism in Palestine that Zionist racism is different from other race supremacist European settler projects, he's saying that while other colonies have instantiated conditions of dependency over the native population, wherein the natives may develop in ways that suit the colonizer, Israel is not primarily motivated by exploitation, although that certainly has occurred. I can't emphasize that enough. Rather, and this is particularly true in the case of Gaza, Palestinians have been configured for eviction, elimination, and dispossession without the opportunity for development. Sarah Roy would later call this de-development in her work from the 1980s. In place of economic exploitation, the so-called ingathering provides an ideological motive that cannot be made to fit with the long-term preservation and exploitation of a Palestinian population. In this regard, Sayegh cites Israeli Defense Minister Moshe Dayan, who once claimed, quote, "Economically we can accommodate a Palestinian population, but this is impossible because it would turn Israel into a poly-Arab Jewish state instead of a Jewish state," end quote. Rather than reconfiguring the Arab population for exploitation, Zionism has systematically dismembered and crippled Palestinian society in order to facilitate their expulsion. The Palestine problem is then this problem of non-being. Given this account of the Palestine problem, it will be no surprise to learn that in a speech delivered in Libya in 1973, Sayegh described Israel as, quote, "a tool of foreign imperialism and an imperialism in its own right." Sayegh and the rest of the PLO Research Center had rather sophisticated understandings of imperialism, US-led capital, and the Israeli economy. They produced detailed studies of both the Israeli and American economies and were well-versed in the works of Joe Stork, Iqbal Ahmad, Paul Sweezy, and Lenin. Thanks to Patrick Higgins' research, we know of one work collectively authored by the Research Center entitled The Foreign Policy of the United States, the Foreign Policy of America. It draws extensively from the work of Harry Magdoff, a noted economist for the Monthly Review. In this work, Magdoff explains how through various mechanisms including banks, foreign aid, tariffs, and militarism, US foreign policy is directed toward one goal, quote, "gaining control over as much of the sources of raw material as possible, wherever these raw materials may be, including potential new sources. Control of raw materials allows leading firms to both limit competition and control the production and prices of finished products further down the supply chain, an important point I'll return to at the end of this talk. This was a known feature of imperial capital, but Magdab emphasizes the importance of raw material domination to the United States in the mid-20th century. He cites a 1952 report from the Truman administration summarizing the desperate situation of post-war U.S. industry suddenly consuming 10% more than it produces. This led Eisenhower in his first inaugural address in 1953 to proclaim the urgent need to secure the top of the supply chain through control of foreign raw materials. And so as a tool of American imperialism, Israel plays a vital role in controlling crucial raw material reserves in West Asia, namely oil fields, of course. As an imperialism in its own right, driven by the political motivation to create a quote-unquote Jewish state, that control takes the form of de-development, or in other words, the non-being of Palestine. Given this understanding of the relation of imperial being and imperialized non-being, what does it mean to say Zionism is a form of racism? What role does racism play in the Zionist movement? As I interpret these documents, racism is the practical administration of de-developmental policies implemented on the basis of a racial distinction between who will be fructified and who will be wasted. Let's consider a few specific examples of Zionist racism from Sayegh's 1975 UN speeches. Consider racism in the Israeli educational system. Sayegh cites the paucity of educational opportunities for Arabs still residing in Israel. The higher the level of education, the more discriminatory the restrictions. Where in 1965, Arabs constituted 10% of all pupils enrolled in post-primary schools, Arabs represented less than 1% of those enrolled in Israeli universities. These disparities particularly affected women, whom Sayegh found underrepresented at every level of the Israeli education system. As Sayegh observed in this 1966 booklet, higher education is almost entirely reserved for Jewish students. That's a quote. And I'd like to emphasize here, a university education would provide, of course, the advanced technical education necessary to any advanced development, a point I'll come back to later in the talk. Regarding labor, Sayegh cites Israeli law prohibiting the employment of Arabs, a policy that clearly has the effect of siphoning economic activity away from the Arab community, denying them the opportunity to develop manufacturing skills. Lack of education and employment is coupled with laws denying Arabs their own property, all of which Sayegh had documented here in this pamphlet. Israel's 1948 emergency regulation on the cultivation of wastelands declared any land unused, quote unquote, unused by the native population due to war conditions, quote unquote, war conditions, could be confiscated by the Israeli government. This is coupled with discriminatory citizenship policies, which provide incredibly lax conditions to Jewish immigrants from affluent countries in near impossible terms to the Arab population. While the 1948 Declaration for the Establishment of the State of Israel declares Israel will be open for Jewish immigration, the 1949 Emergency Land Requisition Law declares Arab land will be seized if, quote, necessary for the defense of the state, public security, the maintenance of essential supplies or essential public services, or, crucially, the absorption of immigrants. All told, these laws define the ingathering itself as a state of emergency, justifying the seizure of Arab land. Given citizenship and land, the Security Service Act of 1949 turns these citizens into soldiers, providing them with arms and military training to then expel more Arabs and occupy more land. This is a sampling of all the evidence Sayegh and his cohort exhibit before the UN General Assembly in the fall of 1975. Resolution 3379 established that this distinction between Jew and Arab, which Sayegh and others reject as a category mistake, is established by Zionists along racial biological lines. what I'd like to emphasize here today is that when we consider Zionist racism in the context of the Palestine problem, which again is the problem of imperial extraction, accumulation, and dispossession, then what Sayegh identified as racism has to be understood as the practical policies of de-development. Again, de-development is Sarah Roy's term for the undermining of Palestinian economic growth through a comprehensive blockade, preventing access to the critical inputs necessary for sustained growth, safety, and sovereignty. The policies Sayegh cites, the denial of educational training, the confiscation of property and land, the marginalization of labor, and the purposeful destruction of infrastructure, are all articulated along hereditary lines and all aim at preventing the Arab population from modernizing and developing technologies and industries. As a state of war, Israel has always understood that Palestinian technological modernization and industrial development is the paramount threat to its ongoing expansion. With that in mind, I'd like to turn to Sayegh's colleague, George Jabbour, who wrote this comparative study of racism across settler colonial societies. After a lengthy examination of settler colonial racism, Jabbour writes, quote, "The settlers whose settlement in lands not theirs was possible only because of the backwardness of the native inhabitants. See in the development of the natives a clear threat to their security and continued existence. The settlers, no matter how strongly they profess their attachment to the concept of progress, no matter how persistently they express their desire to develop the natives, are, in the final analysis, ardent reactionaries when the question of developing the natives comes into the picture," end quote. And so insofar as the ingathering of the exiles manifests itself as a perpetual state of war, Israel approaches the future well-armed. But well-armed is a relative term understood only in relation to the natives' level of industrial development and modernization. Quoting Jabbour, "They can keep themselves superior by keeping their strength superior, and they can keep this if they continue to be more technically advanced. Hence their enemies are not the natives in general, as much as they are the modernized natives, the natives who are both open to sciences and to the world. They are afraid of the future, because the future will bring about inevitably more modernization of the natives," end quote. Again, Zionist racism takes aim at Palestinian modernization, literacy, labor organizing, technical skills, water quality, land and its reserves of raw materials, and the protections offered by the state, creating a historical pattern of decay. Where the imperial subjugation of Palestine is brought about through de-developmental policies at least partially aimed at monopolizing raw material inputs, Sayegh and his colleagues understood that the liberation of Palestine would come about through technical modernization and free access to global supply chains outside the controls of imperial powers. As I mentioned earlier, insofar as the primary audience for these writings were the PLO freedom fighters, no one was better prepared to understand this argument, since their work totally depended on access to raw materials and modern technology. Here again is Jabbour, this time on the mindset of the Fedayeen. Quote, "The espousal of armed struggle is a significant phenomenon, as it requires from the freedom fighter full devotion and unlimited sacrifice. It totally transforms his life pattern. It widens his horizons so that he comes to realize that he is not only a revolutionary against the settlers, but also against the circumstances of his country that made the intrusion of the settlers possible. Unlike traditional resistance to the settlers, armed struggle well understands the world of today with its modern technology and its scientific foundations. Armed struggle is thus a modernizing movement, fighting imperialism and local traditionalism," end quote. In other words, Jabbour believes the act of armed struggle necessarily drags Palestinian society into a future of modernized technological industry, since there are simply no arms without an openness to global production chains and modern industry. where racism is the imposition of de-developmental policies attempting to keep the Palestinian in a primitive state, armed resistance, and by that I mean the gun itself before it's even fired, embraces a technologically developed and modernized future. Note, for example, where anti-Palestinian racism in Israeli schools particularly affected Palestinian women, Sayegh's good friend and colleague, Hisham Sharabi, in this 1970 report on the demographics of Palestinian guerrillas, documents high participation among women along with markedly higher literacy rates. One simply can't effectively operate complex machinery without the ability to read. In sum, the being of Israel is territorial expansion, an expansion that occurs through encroachment wars. The development of the Zionist movement is then the de-development of Arab society. And this de-development is instantiated and perpetuated through bombing and genocide, but also in part through racist, legal, educational, and labor policies, the net effect of which is the excision of Arab society from modern industry and technology. This excision is an important element in the more fundamental elimination of Arabs from the region as a whole, a necessary condition for the creation of a racially exclusive, quote-unquote, Jewish state. When Jabbour says armed struggle widens the horizon of the freedom fighter, he's referring to the very practical recognition of the fact that the resistance stands or falls with the degree to which the indigenous society develops its industrial and technical abilities. The armed part of armed resistance refers precisely to that capacity, just as the D prefix in de-development takes aim at it. And the Fedayeen understands this above all simply because the tools of his or her trade emerge at the intersection of internal productive capacities and global political alliances on the one hand and national sovereignty on the other, with the former being a necessary condition for the latter. Now, as I mentioned earlier, PLO researchers understood from Harry Magdoff and others that the decolonization of development would require, at a minimum, the breaking up of imperial monopoly controls over raw material and supply chains. This was the agenda of what Sayegh called positive neutralism, a doctrine that deserves more attention on another day, but for now, suffice it to say, positive neutralists and others associated with the non-alignment movement sought to overcome rigid monopolistic controls by creating a competitive market in which developing nations could obtain the necessary material inputs on the best terms possible. Sayegh calls this agenda, quote, nothing less than the revolt of the non-aligned countries. It's their active response to the actual existence of a competitive situation in the mid-20th century, making it possible for the emerging nations to strike back at the monopolists and their politically discriminatory or exploitative practices. It's their exercise of the prerogative to diversify their contacts in pursuit of the best and most abundant supplies, as well as the most profitable and least disadvantageous terms, end quote. So to conclude, in sharp contrast to, for example, contemporary Zionist attempts to define racism as a subjective feeling that can then be manufactured and manipulated to the most repressive ends, Sayegh and his colleagues approach racism from within a broader analysis of imperial capital, whereby accumulation is the production of the non-being of Palestine, in part through racist policies. Furthermore, in equally sharp contrast to more romantic accounts of decolonial violence and academia's never-ending carnival of decolonial metaphors, Sayegh's approach to decolonization leads to a sobering analysis of supply chains. For no national security is possible if the raw material required for such security remains monopolized. Resolution 3379 must be approached in this context. It was not a naive foray into diplomacy with the hope of shaming the colonists. Israeli leadership had long indicated they were beyond shame. Sayegh knew that diplomacy alone was insufficient, But at the same time, Palestinian liberation would require more than just the courage of the Fedayeen. It would require a corresponding struggle on the legal and diplomatic fronts. For Sayegh understood all too well that revolutionaries who are incapable of combining illegal forms of struggle with every form of legal struggle are poor revolutionaries indeed. Thank you.
Questions, comments? John, I'll let you field your own
Sure.
questions.
Yeah.
John, thank you so much for this. I was wondering if you could just elaborate a bit on where you left off on the internationalist aspects of the Palestinian struggle, where it was then and where it is now. To me, the dynamics are just so different, especially in terms of where there's a kind of global energy around Palestine. And I wonder if you could speak a bit to how the contexts feel different now.
I'm not sure how you see it. As I see a kind of continuity actually. So I'd be curious how you if I could just ask you to elaborate a little bit. How do you understand the differences? Could you say a bit more about that?
Yeah, no, I'm totally open to the idea of continuity. I'm thinking about actually a comment that I once heard from a Palestinian author who asked somebody else how we could explain this shift from the global south. So if in the Arab world in this period, the energy, the commitment, the politics around Palestinian liberation was very different then than it is now.
Mm-hmm.
You also had countries in the global south that had committed political resources, legal resources, if you will. They had supported these sorts
Yeah,
of
I see what you're saying.
And now what we see is actually there's a lot of energy in the global north around Palestine, a lot of organizing on campuses. And it's not the same thing in terms of what the outcomes are, but we see less of that we see less of I think the commitment to Palestinian liberation in countries, in places that were very committed to.
I see what you're saying.
In the 60s
Yeah.
and 70s.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. I mean, that's a big question. Sayegh's work should be contextualized broadly within the Third International and the Bandung movement. That's non-alignment in particular, this last point I was making about positive neutralism. That's a major theme, is the insistence that newly liberated countries should be able to participate in global markets in ways that facilitate their development. This was a pretty revolutionary point. There's continuities with today's situation insofar as countries that participated in that movement have been able to continue on that trajectory and have gained sovereignty over their own raw material reserves. At the same time, to your point, Sayegh dies in 1980. One of the last things that he wrote was on Camp David, which he saw as just a total disaster. And I think that with Camp David, I mean, other people might see it differently. I'd be open to other points of view. But like with Camp David, you really start to see things fall apart. 1978 looks a lot different than even 1975 when this resolution is passed. The United Nations in the course of the 80s and 90s will be basically remade. In 1991, if you're wondering what happened to Resolution 3379, in 1991, it just gets eliminated. It just gets revoked as I understand it, as a condition for the Oslo Accords, which were themselves a disaster. And so it was just a series of losses. But I think that kind of, that's a trajectory beyond just Fayez Sayegh and the PLO. That's world history, really. So many dominoes fall to bring about what is really a whole new world. So yeah, there's serious discontinuities in that regard. I would say, though, there's an important piece to follow, though, is what non-alignment thinkers or neutralists, positive neutralists, how they understood decolonization, how obsessed they were with control over their own resources, sovereignty over their own land, and a deep understanding as to how supply chains worked. That remains as relevant now in Lebanon, in across the Middle East. Any armed resistance movement is playing that game, I would say, just as the American military is playing that game in its search for the raw materials it needs to create bombs and drones and so forth, what you're all reading about in the news all the time. So it's still very alive and well in that regard. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you so much for your talk, and I'm afraid I had to miss the beginning of it because I was teaching, so
No problem.
you might have to correct misunderstanding on my part. But I was just interested if you could expand on the point about the modernizing tendency of armed struggle, because I was thinking about what that maybe looked like for the PLO at the time, and it makes a certain amount of sense in that context. And I wonder, though, if we haven't seen some very strange twists in that story. For example, with ISIS, that would be an example of an organization which, yes, you could say their own engagement in a form of armed struggle with completely different motives, granted, involved a certain amount of modernization, the use of social media and some stuff like that, but it sat side by side with a kind of not exactly traditionalism, but almost like a spectral kind of appeal to tradition. It was incredibly reactionary in its way, but also in a way deeply inflected by modernity, if you look at it in a certain way. So does that thesis of the PLO, do you think, stand up to scrutiny in terms of subsequent developments? Is it essentially true, or am I understanding the thesis correctly?
I mean, it's a great question. I just would say that you'd have to establish some continuity between the PLO and what the PLO was thinking and what the PLO was writing and what ISIS is. What are the roots of ISIS in the Middle East? Who supports them? Who backs them? To what extent is American foreign policy supportive of ISIS, and to what extent are they hostile to ISIS? U.S. foreign policy in the region has always been opposed to Arab states that serve working class Arab people. Is there an ISIS agenda to create an Arab state that serves Arab working class people? I'm not sure that that's part of what that is. I think that I would suggest that American foreign policy as a whole, dedicated to the creation of chaos in the region, the dismantling of state sovereignty, has which is exactly what the PLO would oppose, it's precisely those conditions that have created the possibility for these types of militias, which I think don't play on the same side of the ball as the PLO and other organizations in the region, with a developmental agenda, if that makes sense, with an anti-imperialist developmental agenda. I just would, it's on that piece where I'd be curious where ISIS has an anti-imperialist platform.
Sure, and I mean, granted they're on opposite sides of the sort of imperialist and anti-colonial equation in that sense, but so then is the idea that armed struggle has a modernizing influence when it's conjoined with an anti-imperialist, or in the context of an anti-imperialist struggle, but then it looks somehow different with a different relationship to imperialism?
Sorry.
No, I was just saying it seems like it would be different if you're on neither side. That's all I was just.
Yeah, I mean, just a more extreme example. Well, maybe that's not really very helpful. The way that you've framed that, I'm not trying to say that just the fact of, that's a good question, just the fact of having a gun isn't enough. There's a theoretical side that's going along with this. Yeah, that's I think is just as important. Yeah, that's helpful. Yeah, Jim.
Thank you, first of all, for this. I would just love to hear you talk a bit more about like what you, from the way that you've shown us how Sayegh and others are thinking about racism and connecting it to the dynamics of imperialism. If you could just talk a little bit more about like how you think this approach to understanding racism is relevant even beyond this case, and how it differs from the kind of ways we're generally taught to, in spaces like the U.S. Academy, disconnect racism from questions of development or questions of imperialism. Just could kind of talk about like the method and like the larger stakes of this kind of approach.
Yeah, that's I mean, first off, I would say there's a lot more PLO Research Center writing on, the dynamics of oil pricing and, what Herzl wrote in his diary and, that type of work than there is analyses of racism. In part, this resolution 3379, it really, if you read Sayegh's statements, it's pretty clear that the whole framing is a strategic framing, and he's going to be working on United Nations terms. You guys say you want this anti-racist agenda. Okay. Here's Zionism. Here's what they say. It's really the way Sayegh works in general. He appears in front of the United Nations. He appears on American TV. He's an Arab Palestinian man. He doesn't expect people to listen to him. So he works through Zionist primary sources. He works through the language of American media. He's a dialectician in that sense. Like he's like in the way Socrates works through the language of his interlocutor to bring about latent contradictions. That's his method. He's quite clear about that as his method. So he spends a lot of time reading Zionist primary sources. Racism comes about because the United Nations wants to talk about racism. Even Chabor's book is a book about settler colonialism. He wants to understand what is this settler colonial form? How does it operate? How can we compare instances in South Africa to what's happening in Israel? Of course, it's strategic in the sense that the Palestinians seem to think that the world understands that what's going on in South Africa isn't good. How come they can't see that there's the same thing happening over here? Maybe we should frame it along those same lines. And so above all, it's interesting in this way, where in the academy we spend a lot of time talking about racism. These authors, I think they're unclear as to where that's going to get them strategically. Like I said, they're much more concerned with geographical questions, land questions, subsoil questions, pipeline questions, oil company memos. They're trying to understand the bigger forces at play and why their land has been usurped. Racism is like not really the motivating reason. And so when you of course, like there's a ideological, I shouldn't be so casual about that. There's a ideological justification for the de-developmental policies that are very important to within the Zionist ideology, but the global forces at play are speaking a different language, and it happens that Zionism fits within their agenda, if that makes sense. So it's in some ways a really different context than what you'd find in academia today. Racism is just not fundamental to the whole thing. They come to this kind of through the back door. There isn't really a whole lot of writing in Sayegh's archive where he's developing an idea of racism. It's here, and then the rest of it is what is colonialism, what is settler colonialism, what is imperialism, and that goes pretty deep. So, yeah.
I wanted to ask two follow-up questions that sister off of the earlier questions. The first one is that I appreciate the way in which you define racism as a practical administration of de-development policies. And later in your talk, you said that racism is a consequence of imperial capital. So in short, the question is, how does racism specifically relate to imperialism? And is it imperialism then that is ultimately the driving force behind racism, even if, of course, there are other forces that are operative as well?
Yeah.
So just getting clear, or maybe it's a quick answer. Yes is the answer?
Well, I mean, one direction this talk could go is, as I mentioned, what 3379 did was establish that who will be developed and who will be de-developed, this will be determined along racial biological lines. So part of what Sayegh is arguing before the United Nations is that when he says Zionism is a form of racism, he's highlighting this point that Zionists define themselves as a people racially and biologically. There were a series of court cases and legislative decisions around who would qualify as a Jew in Israel, and the criteria were established so that it was a biological definition. Of course, the American representatives argued, well, that's not really true because you can convert, but of course these are only authorized conversions, and it's not open in the way that they tried to suggest. And so, because Zionists define themselves biologically, and there's a lot of what Sayegh is doing is saying, look, before the United Nations, to your point, Jennifer, he's saying, here's where Herzl says, where this isn't a religious movement, we're a race, we're a nation, we're a people. This is, and then another leading Zionist ideologue is saying, we're a race, we're a people, we're a nation. But the point is, it's an important piece in determining who will be fructified, who will be wasted. But the dynamics of fructification and waste that's the bigger Palestine question, within which race and racism then finds its place. And so anti-racism isn't for the PLO is going to be anti-imperial above all. And so it's about imagining a society that's not based on racial exploitation, and that's the vision of a secular democracy in Palestine.
Right.
That's
so
what they're advocating.
Imperialism is driving racism as an objective social structure that is the result of global class relations, not subjective attitudes or dispositions or things like this that might be a consequence of that, but they're not the principal driving force.
Yeah,
it's
that's
objective analysis of racism, not a subjective analysis of racism, in short, which I just wanted to get clear on that, and that's really helpful. But then my second question follows up on that. It does seem, and I appreciated Jordan's point, and the way to bring this to a head in a question is, are armed struggle and development always anti-racist? And it would seem, you brought up the ISIS question, but if we generalize that, it would seem that that would be a difficult position to maintain.
Mm-hmm.
For instance, there are imperialist forms of armed struggle and development. Germany developed and engaged in armed struggle to eliminate the Soviet Union, and I don't think most people would consider the Nazi project to be anti-racist.
Yeah.
So you have imperialist development projects, but you also have bourgeois national development projects that aren't of necessity anti-racist.
Yeah.
So it would seem like where your argument is going is that armed struggle and development are anti-racist only insofar as those forms of struggle and development are anti-imperialist, but anti-imperialist in a truly internationalist sense of that term. And so that's the question.
That's a good point.
Is the ultimate conclusion not simply that it's armed struggle and development that's anti-racist, but a very specific form of armed struggle and development that would be anti-imperialist and internationalist?
I mean, I think you make good sense as our own, in terms of our own thinking here this evening. Whether or not that's what George Jabor in the PLO Research Center is writing, I'd have to go back with that question, because as we've been discussing, there always is this question in my mind as to the extent to which the PLO is a bourgeois nationalist movement, and whether or not they fully understand all the things that you just said. So I'd have to go back and I'm not sure if I can answer that on behalf of the PLO Research Center. Yeah. But I think that what you say is right. That the question you ask that's really interesting. I mean, my example is going to be the United States, and then I sort of got confused myself. But then you stepped in with Nazi Germany, and what's the difference? But in any case. Sorry. In any case, I'd have to work more on that. Yeah, that's really helpful. I mean, I think I would just say this. This writing is really close to the events occurring in the moment at that time, and so it's helpful to have these types of conversations, because I get sucked into that level of detail, and they're really clear, like you all read in the graduate seminar, Zionist Diplomacy. The PLO Research Center, Fayez Sayegh and its company, they understand that diplomacy and peace treaties aren't what they seem when you're working with a state that is intent on expansion and usurpation of your land. You're not going to get anywhere that way. So how are you going to respond to imperial aggression? Armed struggle is the only way. What then is required for armed struggle? So when you come to it through in a context, through a set of questions, and sometimes for my own self, I'm just saying like sort of how this research goes is it really helps to have somebody that asks these other questions, you know, because you move step by step through how these authors are approaching the question. You know, like it's almost like I mean the comparison to the American weapons industry or the German weapons industry is so far away from the world where these are being written. You know what I mean? It's hard to think that the author would be asking those questions or making those comparisons. Does that make sense?
But at the same time, the imperialists were engaged in armed struggle and a race to development. It's just at a much higher level of development
than
good
point.
You know, third world or global south, whatever you want to call it.
Good. I'm not. I mean, I don't disagree with that. I'm just trying to thinking through this material. If that's the way, it's a good point. Yeah. In any case, I'll have to think more about that. Did you have a question?
Yes. Thank you so much. I just learned a lot. And I was trying to connect some ideas. I was thinking back of Marx and the idea that all wealth comes from nature and workers. Now, in the case of Palestine, Palestinians are not wanted as workers and not even as reserve army. So they can be completely wasted. And in the imperial logic, they need to be wasted as condition for accessing their resources. And so you mentioned raw materials a few times in the monopolization of that, and I was just curious about the work of Sayegh, if you could name some raw materials that he was mainly interested in his analysis to help us with a picture of the economic history of the region. Oil, natural gas, water, you mentioned land for agriculture also to feed Europe. Have those been constant in this history? In Sayegh's work, can we maybe also find the idea of people being wasted as being a source of profit also for the weapon and war industry? You mentioned also the use of resources to create drones, which made me think of this vicious cycle in which like resources that are necessary for people's survival are being taken away, but then they're being used to create even more destruction, to continue to destroy people by other means. So yeah, just a question about resources and at the expenses of living people.
Yeah, that's a great question. The resource, to the first part of it, the resource above all that they understand driving all of this is oil. British involvement, and then above all, American involvement at the time when Sayegh is writing is driven by this demand to monopolize oil reserves. Of course, though, they understood this basic point that it's not just the reserves that are there, it's the reserves that might be there, that you know are there, but you don't know if they're useful. Imperialism just has an interest in occupying land, even if it doesn't seem to have anything. Because who knows, maybe you wake up one day and the Congo is full of uranium and you really need uranium. thank God you occupied it. It's that type of, they're aware of this type of logic that drives this relationship. I think that to the second part of your question, when I should say also, you can't forget, just as an aside, but you can't forget a shipping channel. I mean, this is a crucial shipping channel. When you're talking about supply chains and production chains, don't forget that part of it, right? And I left that out, but that's important to mention. It's interesting to read Sayegh in the context of the mid-20th century, reading people like Joe Stork, reading Paul Sweezy, reading Harry Magdoff. I find the relation between these PLO Research Center writings and the monthly review people to be really interesting. I learn a lot about just how the world works reading those works and reading them side by side. But of course, you also approach Sayegh's work through the writings of more recent writers. So there's Samir Amin has lived longer than Fayez Sayegh, but Samir Amin writes about this period with decades of history behind him, and you can kind of look back and say, okay, this is what non-alignment was about, and this is what we were doing, and so he's an interesting figure to read back. But then, I mean, I can't help but hear in your question Ali Kadri's work, where Kadri's arguing that the primary commodity produced by the American economy is dead Arabs. That's what the American war industry creates. When Sayegh says that the being of Israel is the non-being of Palestine, I don't think he quite is Ali Kadri. I think that's a little bit of a stretch. But I do think Kadri, or more recent writers, right, if you don't know who Kadri's work, what Kadri says about these things, more recent writers certainly help us appreciate what Sayegh was trying to say, or at least influence how we would interpret what is Israel. Well, it's a tool of foreign imperialism, and it's a form of imperialism itself. What is imperialism? Well, it's the production of this waste, right? The production of this non-being. You can certainly. My point is just that I don't think that Sayegh exactly says what you were suggesting, but it's not hard to see some of the seeds of that type of thinking back with this generation, and these authors who our contemporaries who do say very explicitly what you're offering. They undoubtedly are reading, if not Fayez Sayegh, they're reading a lot of the same material from this period, and they're influenced by it. And I think if you wanted to understand their work, I would really suggest that you go back and read, not this, but I would really suggest that you go back and read, this mid-20th century Leninist writings on monopoly capital. They're really, that's what they're trying to understand. Yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
When mentioning South Africa and Palestine, I can't help but think of the United Arab Emirates acting as a unit in the way that they act like an Israeli ally. How do you think imperialism and racism play into this? How does the civilian struggle draw parallels to that in Palestine?
That's a good question. I mean, I do think that, to your question, to lead things off, I mean, I do think that the dynamics between these countries has changed quite a bit, and there's you know, I just would say there's really no Arab country today that where its government represents its own people. And what the PLO was trying to, what some parts of the PLO were trying to create that type of state. That was their vision. So I mean, the answer to that question all really turns on that point. If there are no Arab countries representing their population, representing the interests of their population, providing them security, providing them the basic elements that the state would provide, it's hard to make comparisons to historical movements that we're trying to accomplish that. Do you see what I'm saying? And so the PLO is trying to draw a parallel with South Africa insofar as South African workers have been discriminated against, exploited, and dispossessed in certain ways that are similar to, but not the same as, what's happened in Palestine. So it's, broadly speaking, this whole period sees, is South Africa, Vietnam, Cuba, Palestine are all connected by an anti-imperialist effort to establish some type of state sovereignty. But of course, state sovereignty, as you see, can take on a lot of different forms. The idea with these projects is that the state would represent the interests of working class people in the state. Of course, that's not how things played out, and so that's where, for instance, in 1999, 3379 can just get repealed so casually. Does that make sense? So, yeah.
Any other questions or comments? Otherwise, please join me in thanking John Harfouch.